talk on artist legacies, and we're very fortunate to have Robert Kipnis with us today. He's the artist whose work is hanging on the walls. And I am particularly honored to have worked with Robert on 3 publications over the last 20 years. And the most recent was 10 years ago with a book that he was very keen to have published on this transitional period of his very early work from when he was both a poet, an active poet, as well as an active visual artist. And so this is the 10-year anniversary of that publication. And we weren't in this space when Robert and I published that particular book. So we thought it was a good time and overdue to celebrate the artist and the book and the poetry, which is also on the wall behind you, and also talk about the importance of preserving an artist's legacy. And one aspect of doing that is through publications. But there's so much more involved, so many more steps to the process that are needed in order to get to that point where you actually can publish a book, if that's something that makes sense. But on the other hand, what's really important is that the information and the artwork and the history and the aspect of what this artistic practice has been is not lost, is not forgotten, and is put into context in a way that becomes relevant to not only present generations but future generations. And we're also very fortunate to have Lori Lyle here with us. Lori is Robert's wife, and she's been working recently. I'm going to just get my notes. Because Lori is also a writer, a journalist, and biographer in her own right. She writes about the lives of American women, including her own. She's the author of initial biographies of 2 women artists, the best-selling Portrait of an Artist, a biography of Georgia O'Keeffe, and Louise Nevelson, A Passionate Life. She's lectured about both artists in many museums and elsewhere around the country and in Canada. And there are another 4 books and a memoir that she's written called Word for Word, A Writer's Life. A native of Providence, Rhode Island. We're delighted you're here, Lori, and I know we'd love to have you speak a little bit about the work you're doing and your own life. So thank you.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about my role with Robert's career, which is very recent. For years, maybe 2 decades, the first 2 decades I knew Robert, when I went to his studio, he wouldn't let me touch anything. I couldn't move a piece of paper. It was like hands off. And then over the years, the studio became very, very crowded with all kinds of things. A lot of papers, a lot of cardboard, a lot of packing materials, all scattered around. CDs, I mean, it was just really a huge number of every surface was covered. And he had run out of space for his prints. They were starting to pile up on top of these flat metal file cabinets. There was one closet that was totally crammed with printed materials. Could hardly shut the door. And at one point, it was actually 10 years ago, I persuaded Robert to let me pack up a couple of boxes and send them to the Archives of American Art, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, which we did. It was sort of a desperate attempt on my part to save important papers, and I just didn't know what was going to happen to everything that was scattered around the studio. And this continued with more things piled up, important things piled up in the studio. And one day, maybe 2 years ago, Robert came down to the apartment where he lived, quite alarmed. He said, something has flown down the chimney into the studio, and it was a bat. A bat had entered the studio, and the bat was apparently living off the bugs that were on the windowsill. And at this point, Robert admitted he needed some help straightening up the studio. And so I want to say that, you know, many artists are much more interested in making art than creating art than keeping track of art, keeping records of everything they've done. And it's really not as if Robert didn't try. He had a system that he devised. This is long before people had personal computers. He devised a system where he put a piece of paper in each drawer with the name of every edition in that drawer. But he forgot to keep them up to date. And when we were looking through the drawer, I was looking through the drawers, we couldn't even find the papers in some of the drawers. So there was no record of what was in those drawers. And then he had another system where he found it extremely boring to put titles on all his prints. A print edition of maybe.
This is the one on top.
I may be corrected here, but there were a lot of prints in those drawers that didn't have titles, and his intention was to title the first one, and then when that one was sold or consigned, then to title the next one. Well, of course, this didn't really happen, and so the drawers were full of prints that were untitled. So it didn't matter for a long time, but Robert remembered. He had to have some memory of where things were. But as he got older, it was harder to remember. And so it was, for prolific artists like Robert, it would have taken, you know, endless hours to record everything. And he frankly he wanted to make art. He wanted to create. He didn't want to have to keep records. So when I realized a couple of years ago that dealers were asking him for prints and we couldn't find them, he couldn't find them, I would look, I couldn't find them, I realized we had a big problem. And I thought briefly, maybe for a matter of months, oh, I can do this. I can get all these prints organized. But then I realized, way over my head, and I was complaining and worrying out loud, and in the presence of Robert's printer, Tony Kirk, who said, I think you need to call Sarah Hanley. And I did. And we've been working together for the past year and a half. And she'll tell you what she's been doing.
It's been wonderful working with you.
So we have a distinguished panel here this morning. Sarah Kirk Hanley is a independent curator and critic based in the greater New York City area, specializing in contemporary prints, multiples, and illustrated artists' books. She's served in leadership positions at the Manhattan Graphics Center, has also worked at Christie's and the Milwaukee Art Museum. So we're delighted to have you here. Thank you, Sarah. In addition to Sarah's joining us today, we have Julia Schwartz, who is the Director of Administration and Development at the Artist Legacy Foundation. The Artist Legacy Foundation is located in Oakland, California, and there she manages the awards program and develops educational programs about legacy planning and studio management. Some key components of things we can talk about today. And then we're also delighted that Daniel Nevers joined us. He's an artist and educator with more than 20 years of experience working in the nonprofit sector, primarily in the areas of communication, fundraising, and strategic planning. So we're delighted to have this incredible group to answer some questions and to first present some detail about the importance of why should an artist care about legacy planning? So I think we'll start with you, Julia.
It's really about the long-term perspective. You've spent your whole life as an artist working on this, and it deserves to be seen in the future. You're recording the world around you, you're recording historical moments, and that has value. And so why wouldn't somebody in the future care to see a visual recording of history? Why wouldn't that be an important thing? It is important, and we need to take care as artists to preserve it, and as stewards, if you're the next generation or if you're working in an institution, you need to take care of that work to preserve history the same way we preserve it in history books.
I have both a scholar's and a sort of nitty-gritty perspective on this, but I would say, as someone who has on occasion had to uncover lost histories, and other artists I know of who people have inquired if I know anything about, that it's really a tragedy when certain artists' history is lost. There's an exhibition opening about a week from now at the International it is renamed the Print Center, New York, on Margaret Lowengrund, who started the Contemporaries Gallery, which was one of Robert's early galleries, and she was also an artist. And it's quite a sad story. Her heirs did not see the value of her work and tossed everything. And this is unfortunately a very common story. And it's quite an effort. Really, many hours go into trying to uncover these lost histories. And if just a little bit of work had been done, it would be so much easier for the scholars who come later. So that's a perspective I bring to the work that I do with Robert's legacy. And it's, I'm thinking ahead about if I were that scholar, what would I want to find or know, and it often involves reconstructing an entire life. And we look at the big picture, going back. So you can see that here. You see the earliest works all the way to some very recent works. And that entire story needs to be told and recorded. And so that later, who knows, 100 years from now, a scholar can say, this is how Robert Kipnis fit into the story of American art in the late 20th century, early 21st century.
I come from the perspective, I've recently joined the board of the Artist Legacy Foundation. I have worked with artists in sort of all capacities in my career, both educating young emerging artists, working as an administrator and fundraiser and curator to support sort of working artists. And now I'm just really curious to kind of understand more deeply the sort of next phase of like what happens to work and when and how do we talk about that as an art profession, which I think is really under discussed and confusing and opaque for most artists, and which is why conversations like this are interesting to me. And I think I'm delighted to sort of think about it from the perspective of like the younger living working artist, and when you start planning for legacy and what does that look like at different phases of an art career. What are sort of the key touch points or milestones that you might want to consider along the way? So I hope that's what I have to offer today.
Absolutely, thank you. So in looking at from a starting point, I mean, we can work back from the perspective of the artist has an established career, has been collected, has worked with or continues to work with galleries. What is it that an artist at that level needs to be mindful of or should have have actually put into the setup of documenting the work that they're doing, or understanding that in order for others to see and interpret what they've been doing, it has to be presented in a certain way. And So I think we start there, and then we can work down from there a bit and talk about, not every artist is it, there are different tiers for the artists who are working in, in our world and in our region. And one approach for one doesn't preclude the same approach for another. They're equally important, but starting with something that we have where there's some tangible substance, what would you recommend? We do.
Yeah,
They do.
I always talk about starting with goal setting. Talk about what are your goals. It's not about what worked for this famous artist or this other artist that you're even friends with that you know. It's what works for you and what works for you right now, because we need to start right now. We can't wait until 10 years in the future to start this work. And so if it's that you can set aside 1 hour of time a week to work on this, what are the goals that you can achieve within that? And what are your bigger goals? Is it that you want to work towards having a publication, but you haven't documented any of your work? You'll need to start with the basics, and you can chip away at that a little bit at a time. And then when you're ready to come to a publication, you've got it all organized, you've got your files all organized, and you're prepared for that next step, that next level. But goals could just be about how do you want to be remembered? And that's a big question that has many different answers. And so thinking through, do I want people to remember that I was a teacher in the community or an activist? What are the other aspects of your life besides the physical work that you leave behind that you feel like helps to tell the story of your life and your contribution to this community or the whole world, and what do you want to be remembered in the long term may also indicate how you want to move forward with your goals. What kind of project might do that in the best way, might be the most impactful or the most memorable, or get your work out there in the right way.
Yeah, and I would say related to that, there's a piece that goes along with it for me. I think artists, it's a challenging job to be an artist, like as a job, as like I'm gonna go out in the world and try to make a living at this and establish a career in this. And one of the things that I think artists often forget is that they have agency in how their work is framed and what it's about and what the ideas are. They often turn over that agency to curators, to gallerists, to people who have more expertise than I do about the history of art or the bigger picture of where I might fit in somewhere. And those voices are very important for contextualizing a practice, but artists are driven by their own set of influences and their own community of artists who might be visual artists and poets and writers and filmmakers. So I think documenting the influences is actually equally important because it provides the context for curatorial voices or authors to kind of interpret the work in the intent of what the artist was thinking or trying to think about. You don't always have the opportunity to interview an artist to understand their thinking. You're often putting work out, a publication that is available to young scholars to kind of examine and do their own writing and research around. And so really the context that the artist is sort of saving around their own influences, as well as like their own writing about the work. And I just think that's equally important because when I know that somebody is influenced by a particular genre, then it really changes how I look at the whole body of work of what they're producing. And I think that that is an equally important thing to try to document. And I would also sort of add to that, just speaking to Lori's point, like thinking about systems of organization. So I really appreciate, Robert, sort of the idea of like, I want to make stuff. I don't want to worry about organizing stuff. Like that's your job. That's the goal of what you're doing. And I do think there is a creative practice in thinking about categories of organization. It is like being inventive about the categorization of your own work is actually a way of like, again, providing context for the work, but it's also a piece of the work as a creative practice, not as a like administrative practice. There's a way in which you can sort of decide, I frame it this way, and these pieces go in that frame, and these pieces go in this frame, and that is like a really, I think, again, it's the agency of the artist to kind of like put their own boundaries around the career.
Conservators spend a lot of time trying to find out exactly what kind of paint so-and-so used, or the tone, you know, the pigments, the binders, the medium, so that they can faithfully conserve the work. So if you have notes there, this is part of the ethos and, you know, the ethics of conservation versus a restorer. You know, someone who's a licensed conservator, that is their job to research the materials and understand and be as faithful as possible to the originals. So if you have notes about the papers, this is some of the work I'm doing now. You know, we've spent a lot of time trying to understand the papers and materials and it is very important to do this work while the artist is living, because only the artist really knows, you know, which paints. And Robert's always telling me, even yesterday, you know, be sure to note that I never used medium, you know, because that's good to know, and it makes the work very archival, actually. So these are all things that artists may think are not important, but they're incredibly important to keep notes about.
Another way of doing that is if you're an artist and you don't want to deal with any paperwork, when you've got an empty tube, if you're a painter, just throw it in a box. If you've got a little scrap of canvas from when you stretched, just snip it off, throw it in the box. That way an archivist or, you know, somebody working in restoration can have an example and they can see the material up close. Sometimes that's incredibly helpful.
Yeah, and I think that applies even to influences and other things. It's like so many artists I know, when I go into their studio, the newspaper clippings pinned up on the wall, the postcard from a museum of an artist that they're interested in, just keep all of that in a box. Like it seems like ephemera, it seems like just extra, but it's actually, if it's in the studio and it's on the wall, it's doing something in the mind of the artist always. It's there for a reason, even if it feels like it's wallpaper or background, you know? And so I think those things, we live with them and then they become invisible to us over time. We stop seeing them, but actually they are really important to the context. And so it can just be stuffing that in a notebook, you know, just like take the postcard and
Hang on to it.
stuff it in there.
Or take a picture.
Yeah.
Take a photo, yeah. One of the, I'm looking at some of the notes that we kind of put together before, as we were preparing for this panel, and there's a list of 3 myths about anticipating, you know, what's going to happen with your work and how it's going to be recorded. And it's a myth that the gallery will do it. It's a myth that the family will do it. They may not know what it is or how to do it. And it's a myth that the museums will do it. It's not going to happen unless there are these materials and something to hold on to that they can get to that will help them really understand and build that story and prevent it from being lost. We started to talk a little bit about the first steps, and I know first steps and setting the goals it shouldn't come too late in the process, I would imagine. Do you think that when's the best time to start?
Now. You know, I talk with a lot of artists in their 70s and 80s and older, and they first come to me and they are a little bit frantic and they say, I got to figure out how to do all of this. I still want to be in my studio making work, which is a priority. How do I just wrap this all up? And in some cases, especially if you are in advanced age, find a team member, somebody like Sarah, that you feel comfortable with and that you can pass off some of these things to. After you set these goals, you've got kind of some action items, right? And so you can say, all right, well, I haven't documented the first 20 years of my work. I've only got the last 20 years of my work documented. So that part's taken care of. Let's go back in time and deal with that other stuff so that if something happens tomorrow and I'm no longer there to provide that information, you know, we've got somebody can see all of the work that I've made. It's digitized or it's in some sort of record book where we can flip through it and somebody can understand the entire trajectory of your career. And work with the technology that works for you. I know some people who have 3x5 note cards with like a little Polaroid or something like that, or a little sketch. If that's what works for you, if you absolutely hate the computer and won't work with it, and you won't work with an assistant who does the computer stuff, then just do the analog way. And another thing that I do with artists who are paper people is I do it on the computer and then I print out a copy and I put it in the binder or I put it in a file drawer. And that way, if I'm not there on that day, they have access to the information and we can update it every time there's an update. Every time the work goes out to a show, every time a work is sold, it's recorded on that hard copy and updated. So work with what works for you so that you will continue doing it rather than just say, I'll pass it off to somebody and never touch it again, because you probably are going to need access to the information. And then the one other thing that I would say is super helpful while you're young and remember all of the moments of your career or stories about particular artworks is sit down with somebody like Sarah or myself. We record it. And maybe it's just having the recorder on all day in the studio, walking around pieces and talking about them, whether it's about materiality, it's like about the subject matter, anything. Being able to have your voice on record talking about the work can be incredibly important. And sometimes people say, oh, I don't think I'm going to say anything important. And then halfway through the day, a gem comes up, something that is so essential to your work that a curator would want to know about, a scholar would want to know about, or that connects your work with greater art history. Amazing. We've got it on record, a surprise.
Yeah.
I think the other piece to also consider early and often is to recognize that there's a cost to preserving work, right? It is not, there are storage costs. There might be hiring an assistant or a conservator, so there are degrees of thinking about legacy and they have associated costs. And that is an important part of the decision about how much you want to preserve. Because thinking about work after your lifetime, there's a certain amount of expense that you want to budget for that, for people to look after the work on your behalf and to promote it on your behalf. And that's part of what I've been interested in learning about working through the Artist Legacy Foundation, is that, there are structures in place to sort of support artists at that level who are ready to take on that financial commitment, have really weighed the benefits and decided it's worth that kind of investment. And so I think there's like a lot of steps in between, like sort of a sort of handing it over to a foundation or setting up an estate to manage your work versus like what are some other practices that you can do. Maybe it's book publishing is a step along the way for some folks, and that has some costs associated with all the work it takes to put stuff like that together. So it is an important consideration, as well as you think of it, not just material, but also cost of time and money.
Yeah, I would say too that before any of this, the most important thing is to have a will and a plan, a legal plan for ownership and transfer of the artwork to someone you trust who will be a good steward of the work. If nothing else happens, that is the most important thing, because at least then it won't be thrown in the dumpster. So this is, it will be there to be discovered or gone through later by someone who has the interest or initiative. And there are many stories like that as well. At least I went to a talk at the Independent 20th Century Fair last week in New York, which had a lot of interesting talks about legacy, actually, because really that's what that fair is about. It's about uncovering artists who may have been forgotten in the 20th century. And Ed Bayard was one of them, and thankfully, he had someone who loved him enough to take his work in when he passed. And so now we can look at it again and understand it. And his friends who are advanced in age too, but remember him, are coming out with their stories. And, this is all important to do while there is someone living who, if the artist themselves did not do that work, at least a friend or family members who recall details can fill in some gaps.
It's also important, you know, if you're going to assign the artwork to go to a steward, like a family member, the family member may not know everything about the business. And so if you as an artist know of somebody else who could be on a team, it's not like everything has to be put on one person and that one person has to manage everything. Sometimes having a small group, might be another artist, might be an arts administrator or a curator that you know, or might be somebody who's just savvy with business or understands the art market and the art world and is sensitive that you don't want to just try and sell everything immediately. You know, you got to pace yourself and you got to have the right relationships. And sometimes, you know, we always talk about being cautious with who you assign as your steward, taking care of your work. You don't want somebody with a financial conflict of interest. You want to make sure that, you know, you want to continue a positive relationship with a dealer if you have a good gallery relationship, but they might have a conflict of financial interest. So you want to be cautious of that and include them in planning, but not make them the primary necessarily. You know, sometimes you think you know an artist and then you see a work and you say, I can't believe they made that. I thought they were one thing and they're this other thing. And that's the real excitement about cataloging an artist's work. You see where they started, how they progressed, how their style changed, how their interest changed, and also how their life changed. I mean, you're following somebody's movement through life, and that's really exciting. And so it's a very personal exploration, a deep exploration of somebody's work. And it's so essential to record everything that you can in the studio. We have found some amazing treasures of Viola Fry's, who's one of the estates that we are stewards for. And you know, you think you know of her as a ceramic artist, but these works on paper are incredible and so valuable and so informative to her process, her working process. And so to bring those forward and to show people who come into our archives, or to share them even with scholars and curators so they can write about them, they say, oh, that opens a door and it reminds me of this other artist's work. And so you're opening new avenues, even if you don't think it's maybe the most important work of your life. That doesn't mean that somebody else isn't going to value it highly. It is still part of your entire body of work and it deserves to be seen. And so if you have that kind of faith in yourself as an artist, that your work has value, then all of it deserves to be cataloged as much as you can, you know, within reason. I know that like we can go pretty deep on the archiving and you should see my databases. There's a lot of fields, but starting out with the basics, which is a high quality image, professionally photographed is highly preferred. But if you don't have that kind of financial support, take a high quality photo with the best lighting you can and be consistent. And then just the basics, like you said, the basic caption information. And I like to go a little deeper and I describe what's in the work. And I do that for preparing, you know, if it's going to go onto a website, you want to have that kind of background text so that somebody who's vision impaired also gets to understand and experience the work. So having that stuff, if you take 5 minutes out of your day to record that, then you can add to that in the future, go deeper if you want to.
Yeah, for me, the deeper levels are more about exhibition history and things like that, which we haven't touched with Robert's work yet. We're getting there, but the papers too are so important to the whole story. So we're getting that all organized. So just, you know, keeping every slip of paper, you know, I think Andy Warhol did that too. He just, even his telephone messages, he'd just throw them in a box. And now we know every moment of every second that he breathed and lived, right? So it seems silly, but you know, there we go. We can completely reinvent his life. And that I'm you may think a little slip of paper isn't important, but just throw it in a box, you know?
So that, for me, that kind of prompts the question, would you
Mhm.
say that that has anything to do with the fact that he's had the success that he's having?
Oh, yeah.
That there is this detail?
I think, well, we all know success is an elusive
Whatever that might mean.
goal,
Name
and
recognition as well as.
random and lucky and all of those
Mhm.
things. But we do know that the most important artists of our time do think about this as soon as they are someone like Jasper Johns, would have this sort of documentation in place. But he also has the resources to, hire people to keep up with it. That's probably 2 full-time people doing this,
Yeah.
So do you have those resources? Probably not. Unless you're him, So it is always that balance of what's achievable.
I also think there is
Yeah.
an aspect, though, of deciding. Again, I come back to art, working with artists so closely, and really understanding just the very hard path of trying to be a professional artist and the anxiety that provokes for folks, the sort of insecurity of like, am I good enough? Am I successful enough? Like, what's the barometer? How do I compare myself, in this sort of like vast field of visual art practice, and what does success even mean? I think it's again, I come back to the idea that there's a sense of agency and a mindset that if you decide your work is worth documenting along the way, that it is going to be valuable, then you can incorporate these practices of saving things, and it doesn't feel you've made the decision that it's important, and that you care about it and people close to you care about it, and then you don't know where it goes beyond circles from there. And so I do think there is just a decision that artists have to make in their careers, and it can look like different things, to sort of decide that I'm going to be successful at this. And you have to sort of make a choice if you're going to keep going down this path, because it's a hard path. You give up a lot to stay on that path. You sacrifice a lot to be on the path. And it is a decision. And I will sort of add to Julia's point about like the keeping work for a long time, looking back at the earliest work, I'm often surprised, yes, there is that time where you can be like, wow, this person made this whole other body of work. It doesn't look like anything I associate with them. But then I also love the thing where you see the early piece that somebody made when they were 20, and you look at the work they're making when they're 70, and you're like, that idea, has been in their work from the very beginning. And there's something so amazing about those connections as well, when you can see the 20-year-old artist and the 7-year-old artist sort of doing the same thing, maybe in a completely different form, but it's about the same idea. And that's also a really important reason, I think, to just keep track,
Absolutely. In the documenting, it's fascinating. And I do appreciate too the importance of not just creating the caption, but also some descriptive narrative to accompany the images.
Yeah.
Because then again, that could also speak to the artist's interpretation, and not just a visual or obvious descriptive viewpoint that someone else might take from looking at that. So I hadn't thought of that. That's good too.
I also want to point out that there are many artists, especially contemporary artists, who are working in ephemeral media or installations, and to acknowledge that work, getting it written down or photographed and into that same archive is incredibly important. I know many people who say, well, I just put that up and then we destroyed it after the show. And it's like, well, do you not want that to be a part of the record of your work? Like, this was really important and it was publicly viewed and thousands of people saw this in situ. Why wouldn't you want that also recorded? And so even if they don't have the best photo of it, we've got it logged in there, and we say, okay, at the end of the exhibition, it was destroyed. So it could be potentially remade. And we always talk with artists, would you want this remade if it was going to go in another exhibition in the future? And having that kind of information written down, your preferences as an artist, is incredibly helpful for the future. If you say, that's it, it needs to be my hands making it in order for it to be the work, that's a really clear distinction.
And that's also a message
Yeah,
that also informs the public about it was one
it
time,
was one time.
and here it is, but it won't be done again because, but then that speaks to process. So that's another question, you know, do you find that it's important to understand or have some of that information available in describing any particular artist's approach to work, to include some aspect of process?
You know, it really depends on if the artist wants to talk about it. I think it's very artist specific. There are some artists where I don't go into their studio at all, you know, and that's fine. It's their private space. They don't want to talk about how they layer paint. They don't want to talk about any of that kind of technical aspect, and I respect that. It's not all about how'd you do that and how can I do it too. But then there are other artists where we just have conversations about the work, and I just ask as many questions as I can when I'm with somebody because I want to know.
Are you recording when you meet with them?
Sometimes, yeah. And sometimes I'm just taking notes on paper so that I can put it into a document in the future, so that they've got some notes taken. Some people don't like to sit around and write about their work, but if it was in a casual conversation and they've either got the recorder or somebody taking notes, that's a much easier way for them to open up about the work.
And then you can have it transcribed and,
Yeah.
and
it's no extra effort for them,
No.
right? It's no stress.
very true. Okay. So some of the other approaches for legacy that we could potentially talk about, I think also have to do with website and social media and directing that in such a way that it really is effective and not random. So are there any recommendations or any thoughts that any of you, all of you, have on the importance of that and how it may be best presented or best maintained? I'm looking at you, Sarah.
Well, we're in the process of rebuilding a website for Mr. Gibness, and Lori is very involved with that. We just had a conversation yesterday about the tone, how should it be? I guess that would be personal as well. The question is, how does the artist want to present themselves to the world, because that's what your website does. It's not something a gallery will do. They just put up the work that's for sale and a price, and that's the end of it. You know, they might have a little bio or something. So you get the chance on your website to tell a wider story of who you are as an artist and your career, and give more information to anyone who wants it, which might be a list of publications, it might be a list of all the exhibitions, or it might be, you know, too much information, which I think is what we're struggling with. We don't want to overwhelm people with everything in Mr. Kipnis's amazing career. It's a long list. So how do we curate that list? You know, what are the important things to know? And then if you want to go deeper, okay, you can download the whole list, you know, that type of thing. But it's a long I mean, we've been discussing this for 6 months or more so far, and we're just getting started, really.
But you're getting started.
Yeah. So.
Daniel.
I will say, I mean, I think we're in a really interesting moment with this, with social media. Instagram is so influential right now as a tool of discovery for many artists. Like, curators actively peruse Instagram and find artists and can reach out to them directly very easily, and vice versa. And that is typically, you know, many artists are posting their work, posting their process. and writing about it in their own voice on social media on a weekly, daily, sometimes multiple times daily basis. It's a generational difference, obviously, the frequency of that. You know, people who are sort of native to that technology just sort of use it as their main method of communication, artists, you know, to the world and to their friends. And so I think there will be a different kind of historical record for future, you know, sort of young artists now who have just been on those platforms their whole career. But certainly even more established artists are also using those tools now. And I do think they are going to be transformative in the way we think about archive. You know, I don't think it's too soon to know, but I think that we are recording a vast amount of information just as a civilization right now through social media. And, you know, we have so much to kind of dig through in some ways.
But do you feel that, you know, especially Instagram, I mean, with a website, you curate that.
Right.
You determine what that forward-facing position is.
Yeah.
With Instagram, you can also curate that,
Absolutely,
depending on
yeah.
the approach that you take. We're not looking for the blow-by-blow, minute-to-minute in the studio, whatever, but unless there's something happening in the studio that day. But
I think
overall,
it really varies.
do you think
Yeah.
do you find it, from a curatorial point of view as well as from an education point of view, positive for the most part?
I think
If it's done well,
I
let me put
think
it
you
that
could.
way.
I think you can get a different sense of the artist as a whole person. So there are some artists who are very disciplined about how they post on social media, and it is highly curated, and it is the work, and it is well lit, and it is, you know, it is thinking about documentation. And there are many artists who are much more just
Freewheeling.
yeah, instant. You know, it's not overthought. It's really sort of just a window into their daily life. And I actually think both of those approaches are valid, and they give you different information about the artists. And you know, just as we were saying, having all the ephemera in the studio of influences and other materials can be really helpful. Like seeing people in the wild, as it were, sort of talking about their work is just another form of like understanding what's going on, how they think about making it, what inspires them when they are documenting those in the moment.
They
through
could have
Instagram.
music going on.
Absolutely,
They could have,
yeah. So I think it's all information, and some curators are going to be more interested in that than others. And I think that's the beauty of kind of, you know, I think there's a lot of beauty in that. I'm not a big social media person in my daily life, but I actually feel like for looking for artists that I'm interested in, it's a great vehicle for that. You get to really discover people you would never find.
otherwise.
A website is about like having, you know, a URL that people go to, but they need to know about it first. They
Right.
need to know your name or know your website, and Instagram just cracks things open because you might be looking at somebody and they're tagged in a photo or something. I think some of my favorite Instagram accounts are not about the work, but they're about what the artist sees. Like there's an artist in the Bay Area, and I love her Instagram because I see her artwork and I understand it more because I see what she's been looking at.
In the context of her life or her
Yeah, it's
her
just
interests.
everyday moments of observation, and then you see the finished artwork and you're like, oh, I get it. And so it's a different way of receiving information from the artist that's not an artist talk or not a piece of writing or anything. It's another avenue in.
Do you also find it to be a way for the artist, I mean, it sounds like for them to expand their circle, for them to raise awareness about the work they're doing in a way that feels honest and authentic.
And much more intergenerational. You know, I know a lot of artists who only hang out with people in their own age group or people that they have exhibited with. You know, there's sort of these different circles in the Bay Area. And you see them at some openings and they're like, oh, I follow you on Instagram. So that's the connection between these two different generations. And they are able to have a really exciting conversation in person because they know of each other's work online.
And it crosses, it's intergenerational, it crosses all spectrums. Which has, I would imagine, some very positive results in
Oh yeah, people
terms of
became
its-
friends because of Instagram.
and raised awareness
Yeah.
of possibilities. Okay.
But with, with any of these technology things, you first need to think about what your goals are. Is it that you want education about the work that exists? Like if you're a family member working on an estate, it may be important to include a chronology on the website that talks about the artist's life and work and how they fit into greater history. But that might not be something that you want to have on a living artist's website too soon. You want to focus on the artwork and on maybe particular bodies of work and not show everything. So it really, how you structure the website is based on what works for you as an artist or what works for the artist that you're working with.
I would just add, in the interest of archiving digital media, which is a huge topic for archivists, I think there's a project to try to document the web, which changes 1 billion times every second or something, which is impossible. So I would just say to think of your social media as an important aspect of your career that needs to be archived occasionally, downloaded. Also, be sure to name a legacy contact, a legacy steward of the account.
And also for younger artists, not to assume that like technology is going to exist in the future.
Right.
We've all lived through
Exactly.
the VCR and the DVD player
Yeah.
and things like that. And so, Instagram won't be here forever.
No, it will one day, you'll find out it's just gone.
Yeah.
And so if you didn't back it up, your Instagram is gone.
Yeah.
But they'll give you some email that got lost in your spam somewhere about how this was going to happen. And then one day you log in and say, where did my Instagram go? Well, so-and-so bought it. We sent you an email 2 years ago and you didn't respond, so that's going to happen. It will happen.
All kinds of interesting thoughts
Yeah.
that we can't control.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have to manage what we can control.
Yeah, it's
That's-
important to
that's-
understand digital media is just as subject to human change as anything else.
As
Yeah.
a paper file.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think this was quite informative, but we're going to open this up and see if anyone has any questions before we wrap up today. So if there's anyone who has any thoughts or any ideas about what you'd like to ask, given the context of information, now's your time.
I'll start.
Okay.
I'm the recipient of an estate of artwork from my dad. And the part I didn't hear anybody mention was copyright in the will. And I also didn't hear anybody mention talk with the person that's going to inherit everything and tell them what you want to have happen, because otherwise you have to guess. I've built the website. I've got the Instagram for my dad. I've cataloged everything. I had a partner has scanned 1,500 artworks in high resolution, et cetera, et cetera. But my question is, I'm doing this kind of on my own. I'm working out connections with institutions, but curators are so busy, and I don't know if you have advice, but I feel like I'm just kind of lost in the wilderness.
Yeah.
So.
This is a huge topic. I participated in a 3-day conference earlier the legal aspects, the copyright, et cetera. These are all important legal considerations. And I did put some books in the back that are from my library you're free to peruse that have advice about these matters. You do need a good lawyer as well who can help you understand intellectual property issues and copyright. There's a free resource that we are all familiar with that you can download that helps you get started on considering all these issues. That was published by the Joan Mitchell Foundation. You have that. So it's important, as you say, I asked Robert to fill out the questionnaire from the artist. What are your intentions? Did you give copyright to anyone? These are things we all need to have sorted out. So your question was about museum placement. Sorry, I was going back to your earlier comments. but we could be here all day talking about legal issues. There is an art law conference coming up that might address. Yeah, that's a very good textbook if you can afford it. It's a legal book, so it's a little pricey, but I have it too. I didn't bring it today, but there are specific guidebooks in the back. One that's very short and digestible, I would say, that also was written by a lawyer. And not quite as expensive, though incredibly expensive for something this big, I would say, by Ramsey Slug. And it is about $90 paperback and just really covers the basics of legal issues for artists to consider. But museums, was a museum curator for a while. And one of the reasons I'm not anymore is I love working with living artists and documenting their work and being able to talk to them and ask them the questions that need to be asked and getting that down. That's what I do in my work now. I do it for young artists, and I am really enjoying doing it for artists who are later in their career as well. So I recognize that what I'm doing will help people in the future. But it is very difficult to break in with museum curators, especially it's getting worse because museums are understaffed generally. And the people who work in museums make very pittance of a salary, which is becoming a real issue finally and thankfully. But I think they really depend on their network and the galleries introducing them to artists.
What do you think about Museum Exchange?
Oh, Museum Exchange, yes, is a new service. I think that it is you could try it and see what you think, but it is not complimentary, I'll just warn you.
To what?
So Museum Exchange is a new business that allows collectors and artists to offer their work to museums. And what they do is send it out in a catalog to the curators in one package. And then the curators can do one-stop shopping and say, okay, yes, I'd like this one for my collection, or this fits into our collecting goals. One thing you absolutely must do if you're going to individually contact a museum is to make sure that the work is a good fit to their institutional mission. And I don't mean just the fact that they show art, but that they have a deep collection in the same area, or they have a scholar, their curator is interested in this period of art, or don't just blindly. I get that a lot when people say, well, can't you just contact the drawing center? And I was like, no, because your work is not a good fit for the drawing center,
So it's making sure that it's a good fit.
Making sure it's a good fit.
There's a connection there.
And I would add, I hear a little bit of sort of like feeling overwhelmed and a little lost in the question. And so I would just add, you're probably committing a certain amount of resources to doing this work on your own and thinking about how much resource could you spend in the short term or maybe over time to try to engage someone professionally to even help out a few hours a week who has connections and who has experience sort of working with archives to just really help you get set up at least, And so it's, again, always a trade-off of, I recognize this stuff is not free. And, I think we're all recognizing there's a cost to doing this kind of work. But it sounds like you're expending some costs anyway. And so maybe redirecting those to hire someone to help out is a possibility.
I have a pretty good team.
Great.
But it also sounds like you've taken a good direction.
Yeah.
You're off to a good start.
She passed away 11 years ago, so it's been a long haul.
Yeah.
And that's also not just financial, but time resources.
Yeah, and I would just also, just to acknowledge for you, like you're not alone in that situation, and you really are. It can feel sometimes. This is maybe a chance for you to sort of like have some connection too with like what an artist's career is like, and to sort of maybe like find the positive side of like just being able to connect to to the artist practice in that way. Yeah, yeah.
On that note, you might be interested in joining our free discussion group. We've got one coming up next month. I put together this discussion group on Zoom. It started out in person, but the pandemic has really opened it up to everybody to participate. And what it's all about is finding connections with people who are going through the same thing that you are. They might be at various stages in the process. You may have more experiences, but that's something that you can bring to this roundtable discussion group. And we talk about aspects, a lot of them are outlined in the Joan Mitchell Foundation call workbook, but sometimes that's too much. It's all of that information. So just looking at one little aspect at a time, such as intellectual property, having that discussion, having a little bit of information, and then opening it up for all of the family members, living artists, studio managers, anybody in the orbit who wants to talk about those topics can come and join us. The other thing I wanted to mention was the Center for Art Law, which puts on great programs. They're very cheap to participate in, and they always have intellectual property primers. And so if you wanted to know more, or if you had, a deeper question, sometimes they have legal clinics.
My point with that was to make sure that the copyright is in the will as a specific entry.
I see.
Because my dad didn't include it, and so it was quite expensive for me to basically contest with my stepmother how that was going to be done.
Yeah,
So
the ownership of it, you
ownership
mean?
of the will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So make sure you
Right.
figure out what you want to do as an artist, and then have that designated in your will.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
If it wasn't, then we had to,
Yeah.
Right.
It was horrible.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
It's always more expensive to settle legal matters after death. It's just better to do it in advance. Yeah.
And working
Thank
with
you.
an attorney who understands the nuances of being an artist and all of the factors, like including that specifically.
Thank you for that. Thank you. In closing, I really wanted to thank the three of you for taking the time and being up here with us. We're really looking forward to being able to continue this conversation or to share whatever materials or information might be worthwhile or you find helpful. You're welcome to call me or to check in with us here if that's helpful. Thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of the weekend and really appreciate you being here. So take care.